Welcome everyone. My name is Alta Lynn Price. I am a translator, and I'm so grateful to see all of these beautiful faces in the audience, and whoever is watching us on Facebook, welcome. It's my great honor, Sant Jordi, the Sant Jordi Festival. My colleague Mary Ann Newman will tell you more about it, but I wanted to give a real welcome to everyone here in Chicago because this is the very first time we're bringing this international festival focused on literature and translation to the Midwest, to Chicago. So I would like to thank Chicago DCASE, the Department of Culture and Special Events, for making this possible. I would like to thank Haymarket Books and Haymarket House for having the books available. And let's see, all the Catalans, that's Mary Ann's specialty. So many of you probably already know, but this is tonight, Friday nights, is the first event of a 3-event mini Lit Fest. Tonight we're at Haymarket House. Tomorrow at 1:30 p.m. Central, we'll be at the Seminary Co-op, where Lucina Schell, Jose Luis Moctezuma, and Daniel Borzutsky will be talking about poetry in translation. And then Sunday at 3 p.m. at Exile in Bookville in the Loop, I will be conversing with Bulgarian translator Isadora Angel about our latest translations and new notions of exile literature. So that's an overview of this mini Lit Fest. Stick around, we have refreshments and food and wine afterward. With that, I'm going to pass the mic to Mary Ann Newman and Erik Noonan, who will be conversing about Catalan literature tonight.
The Noonan team, that's not easy to say. Well, thank you, Alta. The Sant Jordi Festival, Sant Jordi is a book festival, one of the most beautiful book festivals in the world. It takes place in Barcelona on April 23rd. And we have been doing it in New York since 2014. It's usually lit crawls through neighborhoods, from one bookstore to the next. We're like by Borough Hamlin, and we go keep gathering people. In 2020, because of COVID, we were forced online. All right, the Sant Jordi Book Festival is the celebration of St. George, the Dragon Slayer. And the legend has it that when St. George wounded the dragon's wing, 4 drops of blood fell to the ground and a rose bush sprang up. So it was a festival simply a festival of roses, but the Catalan Booksellers Association, the Barcelona Booksellers Association, in the late 1920s, added books into the mix, and it worked. So every year the boulevards of Barcelona fill up with book stands and flower stalls. And it's absolutely extraordinary. So we decided to bring it to the States. And the one change is that since we are doing it in English in the States, in 2014 we decided to expand it to literature and translation as a way of embracing other literatures under the roof of Sant Jordi. And it worked, and that's in part why Alta has become part of the festival. And we decided we wanted to spread beyond New York earlier this year, because Sant Jordi is actually April 23rd. So we're doing a half-year Sant Jordi, like a half-year birthday. And Alta is bringing it to the States. She's brought it to Chicago, and our supporters, we could never have done this without the Catalan delegation to the United States, which supports the Sant Jordi every year. The Barcelona Football Club, if you're soccer fans, they also support Sant Jordi, and now Alta has brought in DCASE. And we have to mention also our extraordinary artists, collaborators, Laia Cabrera and Isabel Duverger. Isabel did this beautiful, beautiful storefront, bookstore. And they also maintain our webpage, because going online in 2020, as happened for so many people, we went from seeing 600 people in person in a week's time at most to 7,000 visitors. So now we would like to keep it hybrid, which is double the effort, but worth it. And Alta has helped us to bring it to Chicago, so I'm really grateful for that. So, and Erik Noonan, we met because he did a wonderful review of Private Life. That's how we met, right? So, and then we met. How did we find each other in Barcelona?
I was in Barcelona and messaged you and said, I'm in Barcelona. What should I see? I've never been here before. And you said, I'm also here.
Yes.
You should come and meet me at a special place.
At the Athenaeum de Barcelona, Ateneo Barcelonés. And so we had a wonderful, and Erik himself, Erik is a wonderful critic, a poet, though you haven't given me your poetry book yet.
I brought it.
Okay. and a great appreciator of literature in general. I've seen his notes for this event and he's done a deep dive, so.
Brief.
But I'm very grateful for your
My
joining
pleasure.
us.
Yeah, no, thank you for inviting me to participate. I'm happy to be here.
Are we projecting?
Yeah, it's been going the whole time.
Okay. So we had thought that we might read a little bit from each. There are 3 books that represent 3 periods in 20th century Catalan history. The first is Private Life, which happens before the Civil War. And as Jordi Puntí says, I believe on the back cover, it's the last great book that doesn't anticipate the Civil War. So it's a book that is not written with the shadow of the Civil War hanging over it. And it is very joyful and very critical. And Sagarra came from an aristocratic family, petty nobility, and he pulls back the curtain and shows you all of their foibles and peccadillos and peccata maggiore. And maybe we could start with.
Let's start with that. Would you like to read a passage from it?
I was thinking.
Okay.
This is actually so you get a sense of who these aristocrats are and how Sagarra looks at them. The story of the Ugarolas was one of many family histories that come to a distasteful and impoverished end, without even a reaction to lend it some tragic nobility, or at very least, a scandalous or picturesque vivacity. Don Tomás de Ugarola y Serradell, the head of the family, had seen all the family's former grandeur melt in his hands until he had become a poor, gray, defenseless man in a massive, unimportant, practically anonymous residence amid the uniform geometry of Barcelona apartment buildings. Heir to what to all appearances was a grand inheritance, but which had already been depleted by the monarchist Carlist wars of the 19th century. Carlist is going to be a theme. And by his father's follies. Mortgaged to the hilt and obliged to pay interminable spouses' shares, legacies, and pensions to the other dependents. When he was 28 years old, Don Tomás found himself owning a big old mansion on Creu de Sant Jordi. He had a university degree that was of no use to him, a fat, fussy wife who was also of no use to him, and a perfect ignorance of everything that matters if one is to fight tooth and nail, to turn situations to one's advantage, and, if nothing more, to save one's own skin from the ferocious attacks or caresses of one's fellow men. What Don Tomás de Ugarola did have to keep him going in compensation was a consciousness of his own magical superiority, which flowed directly and legitimately from 30 generations who had never so much as lifted a blade of straw from the ground. The only weapon Don Tomás de Ugarola could brandish in his defense was his pride of family, without a shred of irony and without a drop of cunning. He's mean.
It's very mean-spirited, and that's why it's so much fun to read. There's a genre of books that is like that, about the decline of a family. The decline of the family represents the decline of the culture in a way. the first thing that I think of is Visconti and The Leopard, which is the film version with Burt Lancaster. But the difference is that it's whereas in The Leopard, everything needs to change to remain the same. In private life, everything changes, nothing is the same. It's really over. And the story is about his children, and there's a blackmail scandal. And the pivot point about it is the closeted or secretive homosexuality of one of the characters. And that's what cannot be revealed, and the whole thing turns because he's blackmailed because of that. So there's a delicious kind of meanness, but it's also very poignant and sort of savage in its view of the morals of the society.
He is very savage, but as you say, the thing is that the book is divided into two parts, and I think that the difference with Visconti is with Lampedusa is that the first half of the book is before the declaration of the Spanish Republic. So you have this moment of dictatorship and utter corruption and the decay of the nobility. And then you have this moment of tremendous optimism, which actually starts before the Republic. This is still a moment of corruption and the dictatorship when the Universal Exhibition is being celebrated in Barcelona in 1929, which is an infusion of tremendous amounts of money to create the new city. And so, but then they go on to the Republic, and there's this sense of how there is an accommodation of the old aristocrats to they kind of incorporate into their salons some interesting young socialists and things like that. So it does. They do find a way to continue, and the 12 families are still. I think there are 15 names in Barcelona that are still influential and important, but you see that whole evolution. And of course, what we know and Sagarra didn't know is that this will end in the Civil War. So, all of that enthusiasm and all of the changes in society are once again cut off.
I want to return to the local view, if you like, and pictures of pre-war, or pre-Republic rather, Barcelona, which Josep Pla is very good for in this kind of journalistic way. But I wonder if we could take a step back for a moment and ask, and if I could ask you why you think this question of Catalan independence or the Spanish Civil War has been so interesting to people who don't live in Spain. Ever since the 1930s, this has been an object of kind of fascination. Maybe people have traveled there to participate in the Spanish Civil War. What is it about this that is still important to people 100 years on? Because people went there to fight from all over the world.
Well, that's the next book. I think that by chance I've translated 3 books that are three periods that link. So Brigadistes is Brigadistes Lives for Liberty by Martí-Rueda are portraits of the international volunteers who went to who not only those who went to fight, but also those who went to drive ambulances. So it's called Brigadistes, which implies soldiers, but in fact, it's all of the participants, and there are a number of women in the book as well. And I think Orwell has a lot to do with that, don't you?
For the publicizing of the cause?
Yes. So I think the actual fact is that you had isolated a quote about the last ideological war.
Yeah, there's a couple. So there's is a study of this by someone whose name I will mispronounce. So that's it. Yes. Yes, and it's about.
We actually have the book.
And we have copies of it here for if you guys are interested. But he says two things. He says first is the part I agree with, and the second is the part I don't think is quite true. And we've spoken about this, and I think you're with me. He says the Spanish Civil War was the last romantic war. Seems pretty
Yes.
accurate.
Yes.
The second half, maybe not so much. He says it's the last ideological war, which, the benefit of hindsight, I think is pretty much not true.
Yeah, well,
People have tried to come up with this.
leftist ideological war, but of course there are many ideological wars. Well, and in some way, all wars are ideological.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, Brigadistes tells you about the Romanticism, and it's a wonderful book because it really brings back the reason that people flocked to Spain from all over the world to defend democracy, to defend a republic, to fight against fascism, and
Yeah.
you know, it was the first step toward the whole fascist endeavor in the mid-20th century. So.
Before we, I do still want to talk about Sagarra a little bit, but let me ask my question in a different way.
Okay.
And I'd like to do that by way of Hemingway.
Mm-hmm.
So Hemingway published a novel in 1940 called For Whom the Bell Tolls, and it's from a quotation from the poet John Donne that's in the front of the book. And it's about guerrilla warfare. Just reread it, and I have to say it holds up pretty well in my reading of it. Anyway, it has this wonderful way of distancing you from the action by translating almost all, or representing almost all of the dialogue in a literal version of the Spanish idiom. Mm-hmm. And so what you get is this weird invented patois, and the main character is never, this is also an alienating sort of effect, is never referred to by his first name. It's always his full name. It's always referred to as Robert Jordan. So it's in the space of a few days, they're supposed to blow up a bridge. The main character is an American language professor who has some experience in works progress administration blowing up things. So he knows demolition, so he knows how to blow up a bridge. But he's having a conversation with one of the Spanish people. And he says, but there are not many, conversation between a Spaniard and an American, but there are not many fascists in your country. There are many who do not know they are fascists, but will find it out when the time comes. But you cannot destroy them until they rebel? No, Robert Jordan said. We cannot destroy them. But we can educate the people so that they will fear fascism and recognize it as it appears and combat it.
That's a terrifying quote.
1940, so it's like, right? I mean, so I wonder if you think this is relevant today.
Do I? Yes, when Erik let me read his notes, and when I saw that quote, I was flabbergasted. Yes, of course. And knowing how to recognize fascism, we were shielded from that. Inappropriately, in Spain, of course, people know how to recognize it, and see it reemerge.
Yeah.
So we're all, in a sense, we're all in the same boat at this point, and we have not been educating people as to how to. Which is why a book like Brigadistes is important, because it really gives you a sense of what the possibilities are of a different kind of vision of society.
Now, if I may,
Sure.
you mentioned Orwell. So Orwell went and actually fought with the PUM, which was one of the factions on the left. And we should say, too, that the impulse in Spain, it was a republic declared, but the impulse behind the Civil War was actually revolutionary.
Yes.
It was a revolution in a specific sense. The trade unions organized
and gender roles,
yes.
and divorce, and yes, it really was trying to turn the society on its head, absolutely. And there was something I wanted to say.
You'll come back to it. So Orwell's understanding of the fascist impulse in Spain was analytical and I think pretty accurate from what I understand. He said that it wasn't fascist in the pan-European sense. The impulse wasn't similar to the one that threw up Mussolini or Hitler. He said it was actually backward-looking. It was an attempt, in Orwell's view, to revive actually feudalism in Spain.
Well, the other thing I wanted to say about the PUM and Andreu Nin is that they were a non-Stalinist revolutionary organization. So they had their own problems with the actual communist apparatus of the Spanish Civil War, but they were the true revolutionary. Well, true. In my opinion.
Well, Orwell is wonderful on that point too, and I think saw it quite clearly because he was with the unit that was done away with. He saw the communists centered in Moscow as actually counter.
Well, one of the beautiful anecdotes in to Catalonia is when Orwell says, "You could not just order the soldiers to do something. You had to explain to them why it needed to be done, because there was this anarchist impulse in the ranks. No ranks. Yeah. He said, but they did it. They were much better soldiers because they were fighting for their, once again, the romantic war, for their principles." And
that's such a good book. The anecdotes are hilarious. He said the things were in such disrepair that there was a particular mortar shell or bomb that they kept lobbing back and forth, and they would write curses to each other on it, and it would land with a new message.
Oh my, yes, we should have had this book on sale too. Should we read from Brigadistes though?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. We should say though too, as you're getting it out, that so we mentioned the Ateneo.
Yes.
Sagarra wrote it.
Yes.
In that library. And so you took me there when we met in Barcelona, and you said, "Here's the Ateneo." And I said, "Yeah, okay, great, thanks." And you said, "This is where he wrote this." Oh, they used to stay open all night. And you said he would write and write, and then he would go out, and your word was carouse.
Yes. Yeah, he would write until 3 o'clock in the morning, and then go out and
do this thing,
and then as President de does I think the character who stands in for Sagarra is actually Guillem de Lloberola, who is the younger man who blackmails the baron, the false baron, somebody who's given his title. And but Guillem is the one who has literary
pretensions.
Yes, pretensions. So I think he's closer to Guillem. And but Frederic, the opening pages of Private Life, Frederic de Lloberola is waking up in the house of an old paramour whom he has hooked up with again.
There's a great, the sort of under society, this very louche half world is really great. Yeah,
the demi-monde is fantastic, and actually that page is so fantastic that I should have read that instead of. But I wanted you to see how he eviscerated the other.
Well, that's why everybody has to buy the book.
Yes, that's true. That's true. So Brigadistes is 60 thumbnail biographies of people from all over the world who went to fight in the Spanish Civil War. And this one is the nurse from Harlem. In each of them, there's a photograph attached to each of them. So the author found the photographs from the Civil War and constructed these autobiographies through his research. The Nurse from Harlem. In the life she dreamed of as a little girl, she would be a physical education teacher. But it was just a dream, because in the United States, the hygiene laws did not allow black people to swim in university pools or major in physical education. She got her nursing degree at the Harlem Hospital School of Nursing, and in 1935, she wanted to travel to Ethiopia to nurse the civilian population that was being shelled by Mussolini's planes. This too was impossible. The New York office of the Red Cross refused her services because the color of her skin made it impossible for her to serve in the name of the institution, even if it was in Africa. We never know what lies behind a closing door, nor what awaits us behind one that opens. When she embarked on the SS Paris from the New York docks, Salaria Kea never imagined that what awaited her on the Iberian Peninsula was something much like utopia. For 14 months of her life, the 14 months that she would serve in the Civil War, no one would look at the color of her skin before deciding if she was a good person or a good nurse. On April 3rd, 1937, she was greeted by the white houses of Bordeaux and the blue of the Mediterranean. The entire town had crowded into the station to welcome the group of doctors and nurses who were arriving from the United States.
Sorry.
That's okay. The camera rang. And ran toward her. He must have been around 10. He grabbed her by the hand and spoke to her in a language she didn't understand. They translated his words for her. He had lost his parents and a brother in the last bombing, and he was asking her to stay, to suspend the rest of her trip, because then she could care for them when the bombs fell again. She knew this was impossible. Her destination was at the front, where men were dying by the thousands. She boarded the train anxious to arrive. But on the road south, as the coastal towns flew by the window overlooking the sea, she could still feel, and all her life would feel, the words of those 5 fingers in her hand. Anyway, good stuff. And this was, for American leftists, the Spanish Civil War had a particular importance. I mean, Jewish communists, African-American communists, well, and not only communists, just people looking for liberty it was a very important contingent in the Spanish Civil War.
Very important to Auden and Isherwood and Spender in England as well.
And Motherwell.
Yeah.
So, but there are wonderful stories about, there's a, I'm not going to read anymore, but.
I want also to talk about you. I think it's important for people to know how you became interested in these things, and maybe gradually, but can you tell us something about why that book seemed important to you to translate, or how the project came about?
This one, in fact, it's one of the few books that I was simply commissioned. Somebody, the publishers, Pluto Press. In this particular case, they found my name on the Instituto Ramon Llull website and decided I would be a good person to translate this book. I'm not sure why. And yeah, it's the only non-literary book that I translated from Catalan, because from the beginning I've been translating classics or modern classics.
And you said yes for a change of pace, or because the stories interested you?
Yes,
you saw a need.
It was also a good gig. It was a moment when it was good for me to have a translation. But I came to love the book because I think it is so sincere, and it does give you such a very special view of the kind of individual commitment to the Spanish Civil War. I think it's very useful in terms of understanding that an ideological war can be so emotional. So
the multitude of different stories is impressive. You get a picture of the whole sort of human world of it, and cultural too.
Right.
As I mentioned, it sent me to Spotify to look up the music that was mentioned, and some of those songs are great.
Well, and that was an interesting thing in terms of Pete Seeger's records of the Spanish Civil War were a really, really important part of my education.
Oh.
Yeah.
How was that? How did you discover them?
I was always interested in.
It was in the air.
Yeah, no, well, yes. It was American folk music, right? But because my aunt, who was in the CIA in Cuba, planted the seeds of my little leftism.
I wasn't going to ask about that because I didn't want to put you on the spot, but now you've done it.
I've outed myself. Yeah, no, my aunt Alice, but.
I love how casually you said, my aunt who was in the CIA.
Well,
as if we all have an aunt who's in the CIA.
Well, don't you?
Maybe. Would I know? How did you find out?
When she retired, she told us. I think my parents knew, but she was stationed in Barcelona during World War II. And when she came to visit me in 1977 when I was living in Barcelona, and we discovered that she had lived across the street from me on the Rambla.
And you went on a little trip together? No.
We did. We went to Andorra.
Oh, did you?
Yes. No. That time we.
But you weren't allowed to say anything about it.
No, at that point she was retired, so we were able. Yes, but the interesting thing is she was with the organization, the Office of Strategic Services, who were not the CIA during the war. Of course, they were fighting for us.
Right.
And Barcelona was neutral territory, and Spain, all of Spain was. But there was a great deal of espionage going on, and in fact, Aunt Alice, the only thing she ever told me about her work in the CIA was that she used to meet with the German double agent to debrief him. And I read a book by Luis Armanier about Sagarra that said that Sagarra used to lend his apartment so that the English and American operatives could debrief the German double agents. So I have a fantasy that my aunt may have actually been in Sagarra's apartment.
Did you submit that FOIA request yet?
I haven't, but I shall. I have to. Yes.
There's a book in this. So have you written about any of this yet?
I wrote an article about travels with my aunt. Yes.
Cool.
But it's just an article. But yeah, it was basically the interesting thing is that travels with my aunt by Graham Greene covers the same period, but of course the character is a very stodgy middle-aged man who has a fabulous aunt who's much more to the left than he and all of that. And we had this other relationship where I was the budding leftist and she was the CIA agent, but she did play that role of introducing me to Cuba when I was 4. And we went to visit Aunt Alice in Cuba under Batista and then under Castro. And then, and then my first trip to Europe was with Aunt Alice by ship, and so she was a very, very important part of my Hispanification.
By ship, you said?
Yes. Yes, that was very nice.
You throw in these little asides as if everybody knows what that's like. You may be the only person here who's traveled to Europe by ship. I mean, cruise ship. Okay.
There was a Holland American line, and it was a beautiful. It is. If you ever have a chance to do a transatlantic crossing, I really recommend it. It's an extraordinary thing to be in the middle of the sea. And we went to Spain, and that was 1967. So it was just a stop in Santiago de Compostela. But yes, it's important to have an aunt.
Who can show you around.
Yeah.
So to go back though a little bit in time to the period when Sagarra was writing. We also have Josep Pla here, who was a diarist.
Which this is the magnificent translation is by Peter Bush. I mean, what we have brought the 3 books that I translated, also available for purchase. Well, the third one is not. The third one is an advance. But this is a book by Josep Pla. It's a chronicle of his life in 1918 that he rewrites as an adult in the 60s, and it's a really extraordinary chronicle, and it's translated by Peter Bush.
And very vivid, almost reportage about the streets and the political scene, and it's brings it to life in a very observational sort of style.
And daily life. I mean, it talks about the cocaine use and all these things. I mean, it's quite a surprising book.
Everything going. Yeah, he seems to miss nothing. He seems to be everywhere at once. But
which is something he has in common with Sagarra. No, they both have a panoscopic. Did I just make a mashup?
Panoscopic.
A panoramic view of Catalan society.
Right.
Yeah.
So there was one passage in particular, though, that reminded me not only of these other stories, but also of your work. Here he is in the library. He says, I work on the translation in the library. It's tough. This is AT HAYMARKET, of course. I would never have thought it. I'm embarrassed to see myself surrounded by so many dictionaries. It's quite beyond the pale. Nonetheless, it allows me to understand why people who devote themselves to learning are so happy. What bliss it must be to rummage among papers and be surrounded by tons of books. The life of the scholar is so enjoyable. Is that true? No. How did you... No, I read that and thought of you, not just this, but of you and your work as a scholar, and you seem to enjoy it a lot. How did this happen? How did you get interested in translating?
Oh, in translate, I am a vocational translator. The first time I actually...
What does that mean?
I will tell you. The first time I actually understood a poem without using a dictionary, which was, of course, the poem 20 of Neruda's 20 poems of love and a desperate song. So I understood...
Me gustas cuando callas?
No. It's puedo escribir los versos más tristes esta noche. I can write the saddest verses this evening to say that. And so immediately I was so moved by this poem. My mother was still alive, and and my aunt was there. My first impulse was to translate it so that they could read it, they could hear it, and to share it with them. And of course, it was a disaster because my mother laughed out loud because there's a phrase "te tuve entre los brazos," and I translated it as "I had you between my arms," which is, of course, sounds really funny in English. So I had you in my arms.
Yes.
And so my mom. But it didn't hold me back. And that's what I mean. It was my vocation. It wasn't something that I, studied in school and
impulse before you knew even what it was.
It was instinctual. It's like people, I suppose, musicians or pianists or people who have a vocation.
While we're on the topic, no, I understand. While we're on the topic. You won the North American Catalan Society Award in 2017.
Yeah, mostly for prose.
And then in 1998 you received the Cross of St. George.
No, that was...
It says 98.
Yes, that's right.
98.
Which I'm wearing.
And there it is.
St. George, that's what the Cross of St. George is.
Which is the highest honor awarded by the Catalan government. There's a sense in which you're not forgive me, just a translator, but a kind of cultural ambassador. In fact, I met a friend of yours, Dan Wolfheimer, and I mentioned that I knew you, and he said, she's awesome. If there's ever going to be a Catalan ambassador to the United States, she'd be it.
I think I should stay. I keep translating. I think I'm much more useful as a translator, but I have, you know.
So if the call comes,
No.
But she is already.
Yes, I think that's the point, right? Is that there's a sense in which the Sant Jordi festival, which is growing in the United States, is as one with there. So you play a role that is more than just, and I don't mean in any way to denigrate the role of the translator, but there's something more in play here, isn't there?
Yeah, you know, I had a Fulbright scholarship to go to do my dissertation research in Barcelona, and the Fulbright rewards scholarship, but it also tries to choose people who have a sort of ambassadorial debt, who will represent the United States abroad and also bring back the culture that they've gone to study. So probably there is, and the impulse to share. Well, I think that the core of translation is the impulse to share, you know, whatever you're, for example, the name of the poem, the first thing I wanted was for someone else to read it with me. So I think that impulse to share Catalan culture is a natural outgrowth of the translating vocation. It's always a translation, there's always a border crossing the translation. So, you know, it's usually either political or sexual.
Or both.
Or both.
Or both, yes.
Best when it's both.
Definitely.
So maybe we can talk about Fuster a little bit too. I mean, there's we have to choose a road here, but and so this is a book that came about because it's the writer's centenary.
Yes.
And so you were approached
by the Valencian Academy of Language.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And did you have a publisher at that time?
No, they were looking for the translators first, and then because we had such a short lead time, there's a publisher in Vilafranca del Penedès, which is registered in the UK, and they would be willing to work with us to make sure that the book came out during the centennial year. So so I was working very closely with the editor, Douglas Suttle.
And distributed by UMass Press.
Distributed by UMass Press, and the distribution point will be here in Chicago. The books will be here in 2 weeks. Sadly, they're not here now.
Oh, wow, that's nice.
Yeah.
So at the time I met you, we sat down, we had a cup of coffee, and you opened your bag and you brought out his book.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, I borrowed this so many times they won't let me take it out anymore, so I had to get a friend to check it out.
You're misremembering. In fact, in the end, I said to them, listen, I'm using this is the only copy of this book that I've been able to find, and I'm using it to do an English translation, and they gave me an extended, I still have the book. Now when I go back to Barcelona, I'm going to give it to them. And I would like to acknowledge the librarians of the Barcelona Athenaeum who have been so generous to let me use the book, because I scanned it, but it's much nicer. It's much better to have the actual physical object.
And you
get to look at that ugly photograph of Joan Fuster and everything.
It's not the best, that one, no. But you seem to be enjoying it very much at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
And I have the sense it's been nothing but a pleasure to do this, even in spite of the short turnaround time.
Yeah, it was doable, apparently. But it is the kind of book where well, I guess every translation is like this. You have the first version, and then you keep peeling away the layers. But in the case of a book of aphorisms, there's a very distinct kind of rhythm. The hardest thing that I had translated before this was a book by Josep Carner of poetry, and I did it. It's a bestiary, so it has a very kind of joyful affect, but at the same time, it's very, very serious, beautiful, rhymed poetry. So, in fact, I did that book, where you learn that you have to, if you are going to render the meaning and in rhyme, you have to practically ignore in the end the original text. You have to flip it completely. And that was an incredible training to do private life, because of course Sagarra also has a very dramatic, he's a dramaturg. He was best known for his drama, but he proposed to write the great Catalan novel. At a time when in the United States, when people, Dos Passos and all were saying, oh, we're going to write the great American novel. So it was the early 20th century desideratum. So Sagarra, I've lost my train of thought.
Well, I was going to ask you about the question of style in English.
Yes.
So I'm glad you paused, although I know you didn't mean to. It's okay. If you translate, and well, there's a citation for the award from 2017, and maybe that's the way to focus on the question of style in English, because you have a writer's sense of writing in English. Your concern, as you just said, is not just to render an original into a destination language, but to make something that is really
literary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you do. But here's what the prize citation says. Mary Ann Newman's translation of Josep Maria de Sagarra's Vida Privada not only makes a major Catalan and European novel available to the English-speaking public, but also vividly captures the precision, brilliance, and richness of the author's singular language. Newman's fluid and elegant translation renders with equal precision the narrative's everyday diction, its lyrical descriptions, and its corrosive yet compassionate social critique. This is an extraordinary version of Sagarra's novel, one that shows Newman's meticulous work of documentation as well as her passion both for the original and for the Catalan language.
And that is the scholarly part of it. There was a great deal of study of, furniture. There's a tapestry, and in fact, Sagarra needed an editor because there's a place where he says something that's kind of incomprehensible in the second half of the book. And I did a little bit of research and figured out how to make it comprehensible, which is something an editor should have done in 1932. But I did a little bit of translating magic there.
So that's the scholarship piece, but I suppose what I'm trying to ask you about is the richesse that is referenced here. I think in my review of the book I compared it to Fitzgerald because of the richness of the prose. So I guess what's up with that? How come you like that? I mean, no, really, like. Let me ask you another way. Sorry. Yeah. What writers are important to you in English?
It's
because you write like your prose is real prose. And that can't be said of all translators.
The good ones, yeah. I think translators are sponges, though. I think when you start to translate, you start to channel all of the things that you've read and all of the conversations you've heard, and you sometimes reach down into the unknown depths of your probably prenatal hearing, and the words appear. You know, I think it's a very funny thing. So I think I've been influenced by everything from Dr. Seuss, who was probably very helpful in translating Carnet, you know, to Shakespeare and Fitzgerald and Hemingway and Alice Munro, Grace Paley. You know, I think when you're translating, everything comes into play. And also, if you've done ridiculous translations like, you know, the prospectus, medical prospectus, that also comes into play. You need to draw on all of that, no?
Yeah.
At some point, it's always going to, something that you didn't anticipate is going to be in a literary context. But I think it's more that we're sponges and we're able to access the language that is sort of latent in us. And, you know, and of course, if you've read a lot of books, it helps.
Catherine, that's a much better answer than I was asking for. I was trying to ask what bands you like, basically. Who are you into? And you were like, well, it's more important than that.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Okay, so Fuster.
Yes.
Who is this person? What is his father was a woodworker?
Well, but that's the interesting thing. The Uberolas lost a lot of their patrimony in the Carlist Wars because this was in 19th century.
That's the family in the
I'm sorry, the family and private life.
Yep.
Yes. And the Carlist Wars were in the 19th century. The Prince Charles was the preferred pretender to the throne for a very Catholic kind of reactionary part of Spain, and there were many wars, in fact, and confrontations. And this I think that there probably aren't any Carlists nowadays, but at the time of Sagarra and at the time of Fuster there were. So Fuster's father was a Carlist, but he said something very, very interesting in his prologue. Oh no, not in the prologue, in something else I read, in another article he wrote, that his father was an unusual Carlist. He was, his father came from a farming background, so he wasn't an aristocrat, which was really the more Carlist tendency. And he said, my father was from a popular Carlist, which made him a kind of anarchist.
He says that in the prologue.
It's in the prologue, yeah. And he said it in the prologue.
Yeah.
Huh.
Or you said it in your
I think I said it in the
epilogue.
prologue, yeah. He talked about his father being a Carlist in the prologue, yes, he did. But I don't think he said that particular thing about the anarchism. But in any case, Fuster is a self-invented philosopher. Eugène Dors, whom I studied for my dissertation, called himself a household philosopher, un filòsof d'estar per casa. And Fuster, in a way, is like that too, in the sense that he literally he's practically a hermit, which is the origin of the title of this. He stays in his house in Sueca. He goes out to forage for whiskey and books and records, and he takes them back home, and then all of the Catalan intelligentsia find their way to his door. And Catalan includes Balearic and people from the Principate of Catalonia. And he receives, and he holds forth, and he's
So he was known to his contemporaries, and they sought him out.
They sought him out.
He was a kind of luminary to them.
Yes.
Yes. And there was some persecution involved as well. His house was...
Because he wrote a book called We the Valencians in the 60s. Of course, Franco died in 1972. 75. And Fuster wrote a book about Valencian identity in the 60s, in 65, I believe. And
this was seen as seditious by the hard right.
Right. And also was, there were people on the...
Incredible to think that there was ever a time when personal violent attacks against writers occurred for things that they wrote.
Isn't that I know.
It must have been a terrible time.
Well, and it was interesting because he was in his house with a couple of other writers, and they actually set 2 bombs with the idea of bringing them out and then having the second bomb actually do the damage. But fortunately, it didn't. It destroyed a good part of his library. But you know, he was treading on very dangerous ground always, and to be a Valencianist, a Valencian Catalanist, or a Catalanist from Valencia, was
the Catalan language illegal at the time?
yes, well, illegal. Illegal in the sense that you couldn't speak it in any kind of public place. In the 60s, it was very hard to do. It was the language you spoke at home. Curiously, Balthazar Purcell once pointed this out to me, that in the 1960s, Mercedes published her great novel, La Plaza del Diamant, and in Mallorca, Villalonga published Bearn. So some of the great Catalan literature was actually being written in the 60s. These were people who had been formed in the Republic, or at the time of the Republic. But
and all of them leading kind of fugitive lives, though, at the same time.
not Villalonga. He was at home in Mallorca, but certainly Revuelta was in exile.
Right.
You too. I'm so sorry to be the time police, but we just in terms of we have like just a few more minutes.
Thank you.
And I'm sensing that the conversation could go on all night, so I just want to make sure we
Do you want to hear a little bit of Fuster before we close?
Yeah.
That we can close.
The conversation, by the way, is going to go on after this.
Yes.
You're welcome to converse with us.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, while you're looking, I mean, I read he has a dictionary. He wrote a dictionary for the idle. And he has these wonderful metaphors. One of the best ones is view of history. He has a metaphor for turns of fate, and his metaphor for turns of fate is Cleopatra's nose.
Oh,
So there's always a historical context, and he calls it Cleopatra's nose syndrome. It's always going to get you. You can't.
he has an aphorism about that in this book too, but I'm not sure where. So this is a collection. This book that doesn't. Here it is.
That will be here in 2 weeks.
That will be here in 2 weeks.
And is available for pre-order.
Yes.
Is a collection of 2 different books. One called Final Judgements, because the title of the book I translated from is Conseils, counsels, or advice, proverbs, and insolences, which was a really terrible title in English. But Final Judgements is fantastic because it contains a joke in itself, because final judgment is usually singular. So Final Judgements is already subverting the whole notion of a final judgment.
It's also the opposite of first impressions.
Yes, that's true. So it has a couple of different books in it. Final Judgments and, dishonest propositions. It was hard to decide whether to do Final Judgments or dishonest propositions, but I thought that was a little more...
And these are like philosophical one-liners. It's basically tweets.
Well, Andrew Lee has a book about it. It's a theory of aphorisms from Confucius to Twitter, and they are. But one of the really interesting distinctions that people draw between a maxim and an aphorism is that a maxim is trying to tell you a truth, and something that will be applicable universally, whereas an aphorism is actually trying to undermine the maxim. And it is opening it sometimes often establishes a proposition in the first clause and then undermines it in the second. So, it actually is opening discussion, and that's what Fuster says his purpose is to open discussion, just in general. So I'll just read you a few. Works and Days, which is Hesiod, a reference to Hesiod. Writing, making literature, is all those things you say it is, and what's more, it is a form of vengeance. One of the dangers an artist is exposed to is that of becoming a precursor. This is the equivalent of being an epigone born before your time. Oh, this one I love. Don't kid yourselves, friends who attend concerts. Music, all music, from Palestrina or Bach to Armstrong or Stravinsky, is meant to be danced or sung. Fuster is very sensual. You know, he has lots of observations about music and art that really come from a sensual understanding of the arts. He has one that's that I don't remember the concert, but this concert by Vivaldi, he said, can be danced as a foxtrot. Try it yourself.
And you had this vision of him
yes,
doing
waiting
the
at home.
foxtrot in his
Yes.
library.
Yeah. Piero della Francesca would have been a perfect genius as a painter if only he had known how to paint a good smile. Every word is already, per se, a periphrasis. The worst thing about plagiarism is not that it is theft, but rather that it is redundant. The music of Vivaldi is pure conversation. In art, as in any other activity, it is advisable to imitate for as long as possible. Only when there is no other choice does it become tolerable to the original. It must be admitted, to admire, that is, to feel admiration for someone or something, is a very laborious operation, and in the long run, a bore. And I don't know what I would like to finish with. I don't know if hearing 4 or 5 aphorisms really can give you the sense of this book. There's a kind of crescendo of meaning and of thinking, and of course he contradicts himself because he contains multitudes and because that is his philosophical posture of questioning everything. He's a true humanist in this sense, and so. But I really do recommend it. It's a wonderful book.
It's very funny.
Mm-hmm.
It holds up under a complete reading, so one can read these in sequence. They're very carefully curated, I think, into sections. It's very literary, if that's your thing. Yeah, it's a great book. And available for pre-order. People can get it from the press itself.
If you write your name on that list and put an asterisk next to it, we will let the publisher know that you would like to order the book.
And the publisher will reach out to them directly. Oh, okay. So put your name on the list, star next to your name, and they'll get in touch and tell you how to get it.
And thank you so much for coming out, for joining us. I don't know if we use up all the time or if there's time for questions.
Well, I think we should do a few minutes of questions and answers if there's any questions from the audience.
Have any of you read? Yes.
I have a question. It seems like you went from Spanish to Catalan, and how did you do that?
Yeah, I studied Spanish first, and when I was 20, I went to a junior semester abroad in Madrid. And Madrid, when I was 20, it was 1972, and Madrid was a very, very dark city to my coming from New York, which was thought it was on the verge of revolution, and Madrid was very fascist. But I took the train to Barcelona, and I fell in love from the train practically with the landscape. You pulled into the Estació de França, which is this beautiful 19th century station. You could see a little bit of the sea.
That station's very beautiful.
Oh, it's amazing. And then, you know, and then the city and the streets and the people and the bilingualism. I came from New York with a very strong sense of bilingual culture, and so the fact that there was this other language there. I knew Catalan culture existed. It wasn't, oh my God, what is this? You know? But I was immediately drawn to it. And of course, you know, Barcelona. Later I got to know the rest of Catalonia, but the city itself it's a museum, you know. And so, you know, to discover the modernist buildings, to go to the Casa Quarter, to have the mountains and the sea, it's a perfect city. And so that was the start of that. And my tendency, I went back to do my master's in 1975 because I wanted to see Spain after Franco, but once again I went to Madrid, and once again I fled. Being taped. And I went to Barcelona and thought, oh, I won't stay unless I find a job. I didn't want to be a tourist or a student. And I found a job. And I spent 1977 there, which was the year that all of the political parties were legalized. There was the anarchist days in the Parkway. There was the first gay rights parade by the Fronda Libramental. So it was an incredible year to be there. And I lived on the Rambla, so every time something was happening, I would go down and listen and talk. And I went back to New York with a sense of the music of the language. And then I bought myself a Teach Yourself Catalan book by Alan Yates and taught myself Catalan. And I got a little group of people together and taught them Catalan. And that's how it happened.
The rest is history. Any other questions? Have time for one or two more?
Have any of you read Private Life or? Yeah, of course. This is Bella Lee, who is now teaching in Chicago, but she's a novelist herself and has a wonderful book, also with Pluto Press, called Wilder Winds. Yes, it's a beautiful book of short stories. So we should have an event about that for real Sant Jordi.
Okay.
Yes. Is there anything you'd like to say about Private Life or Sagarra?
No, let's just drink wine.
Okay.
On that note, let's drink wine. Thank you, everyone.
I think Sagarra would love that we're drinking wine.
Yeah, I think so.
You would be smoking too.
Briefly. Oh,
Sagarra.
I'll say, yeah.
Thank you guys so much. So we're all of us in the room are going to enjoy some cava now. We've brought in the refreshments. I'm sorry for everyone who's live streaming. Break open a bottle at home. And hopefully we'll see you tomorrow at 1:30 Central or at Seminary Co-op for poetry and translation. Thanks again.
Yes. Latin American poetry.